Hello, everyone. I'd like to first start by thanking you for joining our webinar, Inside the Peloton Sports Nutrition Live from the Vuelta. We're very fortunate to have with us today one of our valued team partners, EF Education-EasyPost. We have joining from EF, Will Grueling, who is the head nutritionist. Later in the webinar, we may have a guest appearance from Owen Blandy, who is the team chef as well. And finally, we have with us today Oscar Jeukendrup, who is Chief Scientific Officer at Neversecond. My name is Bill Armstrong. Today's discussion will focus on how the EF Performance Support Team helps the riders prepare for the hot and grueling stages of the Vuelta. The discussion will last about 30 minutes or so. During this time, at any time, you're welcome to enter any questions that you have into the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to answer them during the second part of our webinar. Thanks once again for joining, and now we will turn you over to Dr. Oscar Jeukendrup.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Bill, and maybe important to mention as well that this is brought to you by Neversecond, and Bill is the CEO of Neversecond. I'm gonna start today. I'm going to start today with talking a little bit about sort of the science. We're going to focus because it's so hot in the Vuelta. We're going to focus a little bit on the topic of hydration, and maybe along the way bust a few myths, but also give a few hopefully useful guidelines. And then I'm going to talk to Will about how does it actually work in practice in the real world with real riders, and also maybe we can discuss some of the challenges of doing that. And then when Owen gets a chance, today is a really difficult day for Owen, because he's in the kitchen preparing meals. The riders are coming in one by one from their time trials. It's not like it's 8 o'clock is dinner time and he serves them all. They all come at different times, so it's a crazy day for Owen. But hopefully we can still get him at some point when he has a little gap. And Will, you can let me know when that time is, and if I have to stop my presentation, I'll stop it. We'll let him in whenever he has time. But let me just set the scene a little bit by just doing a 15-minute sort of science talk on hydration. And it's not probably the sort of usual talk on hydration. Bill, you may have to give me permission to share my screen. And
okay.
Then
you should be all set.
Okay, perfect. Then you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes.
Okay, so I want to go back, way back actually, to the 60s. In the 60s, the views on hydration were a little bit different. These are just some quotes I have here from George Ronse, who was a trainer from Belgium. He was actually world champion in 1928 and 1929. And in those days, hydration was looked at very differently. It was recommended to ride in hot weather without water, and also to eat salty fish. And the idea there was that would condition the body to work without water. So essentially training your body to not have water. Avoid drinking when racing. This is from his training Bible that he wrote, especially in hot weather. Drink as little as possible and with a liquid not too cold. Quite different, I think, Will, from what you will be telling us. In the 60s also, these are some further quotes. When you drink too much, you will perspire and you will lose your strength. You're almost sweating out your power. Also different views these days. We were told to limit drinking to 4 bottles per Tour de France stage. Imagine that on a hot day. Drinking more was frowned upon, and in those days they had stages that were well over 300 kilometers as well. So 4 bottles. Now, why do we need water? Well, water helps us to cool. So, very simplistic view, if we see the muscle as an engine, the engine produces power, and that power results in speed, and how much speed depends on things like technique and aerodynamics. Of course, we put fuel into the engine, and that helps the engine to generate this power. But as the engine works, only 20% is actually going into movement, and 80%, just like similar efficiency to a car, 80% is going into heat production. And that means, especially with the powers that the guys that Will is working with are producing, that is an enormous amount of heat production. If we wouldn't have mechanisms in place to get rid of that heat, then in extreme cases, we have Owen there.
Hey guys.
Live from the kitchen, Owen. Welcome.
Live from the kitchen. Yeah, that's it.
Shall I continue my my work and you continue yours?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, give me a shout when you have a moment, and then we'll you can tell us a little bit what you're doing.
I will do, yeah.
Or if now is the best time, then that's fine too.
Yeah, I can tell you what I'm doing now. So the riders have just finished, or are finishing the TT, and this is a unfamiliar day because they're actually cycling back to the hotel because the finish is it's kind of more effort for them to take a bus and sit down, and so I think it's quicker for the riders, it's quicker for the staff, for the riders to ride from the finish back to the hotel. They get a cool down then as well, so maybe it's beneficial for their bodies. Anyway, so I'm preparing post-race food, which today is potato gnocchi, a homemade pesto that I've made with coriander and lemon and pumpkin seed, and then some cooked turkey, some turkey breast, which I've just baked in the oven and just adding to the gnocchi. And then I've made a melon smoothie as well. So they'll have, because it's very humid, it's very hot here, so they'll have a nice sort of cooling drink, I guess, the melon and the banana. Yeah, hopefully lower their body temperature, get some fluids back in the system. And then the gnocchi and the turkey is just a recovery meal, essentially, plain and simple.
Very nice, and making me hungry. You're selling it very well. It's like a,
Yeah, it tastes good too.
like a pro selling this. So, Owen, where are you at the moment? Maybe you can explain that a little bit.
We are near Alicante, so the town is Elche. We've been here this is the third night we've been here. And this was the first night from the transfer from north of Spain. So we're now in the Mediterranean coast. It's been a interesting start to the Vuelta, coming from Holland, then to Basque and Galicia, Asturias, and now all the way southeast Spain. So a lot of travel for the guys.
A lot of driving, yeah.
A lot of driving, and also flights for them. And I think they just want to, on a grand tour, I think they just want to keep moving. They just, the days roll into each other, and when they're stagnated with big travel days, it's not pleasant for everyone really. But they're all the riders are really happy. Yeah, looking to push on the next 10 days and see where it'll take us.
Yeah, and you're driving the kitchen truck that you're in now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from place to place, and then so where do you get your groceries from? Like, how does that work?
So I email ahead the hotels and I put a list together of everything that I need. And what I do is I usually I kind of work on a schedule of 2 or 3 days in advance. So I'll be ordering stuff. I mean, I've sent the email 3 weeks ago, but I'll be ordering stuff for Thursday or Friday, because you never know. I might get to a hotel and the produce just will either be out of date or old or not organic or not the best quality. So I always have stuff in my fridges. I have chicken, I have fish, I mean, I've got all the pasta and rice and dry goods, but in terms of fresh food, I have plan A, B, and C essentially, which is what you have to do in such a flexible environment. You know, so dynamic, things change, and you have to be adaptable to the environment. So, but the hotels are really great usually. You know, the best situation is where the chef will invite me into the kitchen. He'll invite me into the walk-in fridge, and he'll just say, you know, help yourself. You know, they realize we're only there for a night or two. We're not using loads and loads of ingredients, and they're usually very happy to show off what they have and, you know, welcome the team in. So I enjoy the work with the hotels. It's really, it's fulfilling, really. Meeting a new group of hotel staff and kitchen staff and waiter, you know, it's enjoyable. It's a good part of the job.
What so I guess language sometimes is an issue then as well, or like how do you manage that?
The universal kitchen language, I guess, for sure. There's nothing a cap and a couple of bidons will put a smile on anyone's face. Yeah, which always helps. But yeah, I mean, I speak French. Spanish is coming along, but I'm not fluent by any means. Yeah, I make do. Make
it work.
Yeah,
brilliant.
I'm gonna run into the dining room because the guys might be coming back. But I'll be back.
Yeah, we'll let you. We'll you can leave it on, but we'll let you go when because I understand you're very busy.
Yeah, no, but I'll still be online. So if anyone has any questions at the end, just feel free to ask me. No problem.
Perfect. Great to have you. Thanks, Owen.
I'll get back to you guys.
Cool. Well, I'll go back to my to my presentation. So didn't get very far, but
let's see. Okay.
Yeah. So this is where I was. So I was 80% of all the energy that we use goes into heat production. Only 20% actually in power, and that heat we need to get rid of because otherwise overheating will result very quickly. We can gain 1 degree C in 1 minute if we don't cool. So that would be like within 5 minutes we would be literally cooked and done, and probably not even survive if that was possible. But fortunately we have cooling mechanisms, and fluid is very important for those cooling mechanisms to work properly, and this is why dehydration can become a danger. Of course, in really hot conditions where it's very humid, it's very difficult to sweat, and in those conditions, it's overheating is a real problem, or can be a real problem. The advantage that cyclists have, of course, that they move at quite a speed, so they always have quite a bit of cooling wind. So overheating is much less of a problem in cycling than it is in like a sport like running, for example. Now, if we go to some of the old textbooks, then these textbooks would tell us if we dehydrate by 2% or 3%, we will get negative effects 4 to 6%. We will get reduced muscular strength, reduced endurance. You see heat cramps. If it's more than 6%, then we get increased risk of severe heat cramps. And the 6%, of course, refers to the weight that we lose. The weight that we lose is a measure of how much fluid we lose, and thus how much we sweat. Now, I think these numbers are a little bit exaggerated, and that has to do with the way studies were originally designed. And I also think that these percentages are incredibly individual, where some runners that I worked with, like one of them being Haile Gebrselassie, who ran a world record and lost like almost 10% of his body weight in doing that. And obviously it didn't impair his performance that much. So I think these numbers need to be taken a little bit with a grain of salt, but very clearly, the more dehydrated you become, the more problems you can expect. There are physiological explanations for that. If you lose fluids, you get a reduction in blood volume. That means there is less blood flow to the skin. That means you can sweat less. That then means that you cannot get rid of heat anymore. Your temperature increases. That has a number of effects. It causes fatigue, partly because you increase glycogen use. And also we see with dehydration, we see a lot more GI problems. So this is all like pretty well established in the literature, but we do have a bit of a controversy in the literature as well. These are two books that are, in my opinion, sort of the extremes. The first one tells the Gatorade story, and it's about sort of drinking is essential. Messages like drink as much as you can tolerate are in there. Overhydration can cause hyponatremia, drinking to thirst, or drinking to a plan. These are all things that's like drinking to thirst is something that fits with the book below by Tim Noakes, Waterlog. Drinking to a plan is probably something that I would talk about. But I think these extreme viewpoints that you have in these books, they're never really helpful. So if we put these two strategies next to each other, then drinking to thirst, I think, will work in a lot of situations, especially slower athletes, shorter duration exercise. I think that strategy is actually fine. But on the other hand, drinking to thirst is not really a strategy. How do you plan for that? How do you know how thirsty you're going to be and how much drink you're going to need? The third point, I think, is really important for longer exercise. If you may be missing an opportunity, if you wait till you're thirsty and you get thirsty 2.5 hours into exercise, that means you haven't drank anything for the first 2.5 hours, which is the time when the GI tract is working very well. And then you start to take something at a time where maybe it stops working very well. So absorption may not be optimal. So I think you would be missing an opportunity. I also think that thirst is not always an accurate reflection of dehydration. So I would definitely plan my drinking instead of just relying on my thirst feelings. Now, one of the things we know, and will probably talk about this a bit, but there are huge differences in sweat rate between individuals. And this is from a study where they looked at different sports. But if you just look at the blue bar, there's all of these sports taken together. You can see that sweat rate varies from 200 mils per hour all the way to somewhere like 2.7 liters per hour. Huge sweat rate. So any drinking advice that says, oh, you need to drink 1 bottle per hour, it's complete nonsense, because it's way too much for this person and is not nearly enough for this person. And I still see that advice printed somewhere. It's just too simplistic. So the only way to get a better idea of how much you really need is to measure your sweat rate and know your sweat rate in different conditions. Now, what we would be aiming for in terms of drinking is not this line, which would be like your weight stays stable during exercise. There's no weight gain, no weight loss. You don't need to drink that much. It is okay to lose a little bit of weight. Also, because especially during prolonged exercise, that weight loss is not just water, it's also glycogen, it's also a little bit of fat. So some weight loss is absolutely fine. Also, less than 2% weight loss is not going to affect performance or physiology in any way. What we definitely want to prevent is weight gain, because that's not going to help performance, and it has health risks associated with it, hyponatremia. So we definitely don't want to gain weight, and actually we don't want to maintain weight. We just want to lose a little bit of weight, but we don't want to lose so much that we're going to affect physiology. So that's really, this is our goal, losing between 2 and 3%. And whether it's 2 or 3% probably depends a little bit on the conditions. In this case, you can see a study here where they showed that if the conditions were 20%, dehydration had a negative effect on performance. If it was cool, it had no effect on performance. So the environment also determines whether 2 or 3% is better. If it's hot, I wouldn't want to lose too much. If it's cold, it probably doesn't matter so much, and 3% is probably absolutely no problem. So then there is the whole story about electrolytes. We get told, and most of us probably believe very strongly, that electrolytes are extremely important for hydration. It's like hydration and electrolytes are usually mentioned in the same sentence. Now, what we've done recently, and you can read a series of blogs on My Sports Science on this topic, is analyze the literature and to see what evidence do we actually have that these electrolytes are so important. And the most important, without doubt, is sodium. Sodium, we have about 70 grams in the body, and we have a concentration in the blood that is very, very constant. And it's very important that it stays that value for a number of body functions. If it drops too low, then that has very severe consequences. So it's extremely regulated. Now here you have a number of electrolytes, the total amount that is stored in the body, the amount in or the concentration in the blood, and the concentration in the sweat. And the first thing you should notice is that we have like relatively large amounts in the body, but the amounts we lose in sweat are extremely small. So like so small that we would need to lose so many liters of sweat before it actually affects the total amount of that electrolyte in the body. There is also a difference between blood and sweat. Sweat is always more dilute than blood, and that means that losing the water is always going to be a bigger problem than losing the electrolyte. So if I've just very simply summarized this, and I would encourage you to go to these blogs to read a little bit more about the background, but these are some of the claims why people say we need electrolytes, well, we need sodium before exercise to retain fluid. Well, there is strong evidence that actually it does help to retain fluid. What is unclear is if this is also useful in terms of performance. I think there are situations where it might be, but in many cases it's not. During exercise, it helps absorption of fluid. Well, there are some effects, but they're very, very small. Maintaining blood sodium, yes, it does, but only in very extreme conditions. Avoid depletion of body sodium, really no evidence. Preventing cramps, muscle cramps, little or no evidence. And this one may be really surprising. There are only 5 studies that have looked at the effect of sodium on performance. And of those 5 studies, 4 show no effect at all, and 1 shows such a large effect that no one will believe it. It was a 20% improvement in Ironman or half Ironman performance. So it's just like not realistic. So little or no evidence. After exercise, retaining fluid, yes, we have evidence. And replacing a sodium deficit, well, maybe only in extreme conditions. So really the story is not as strong as it's often portrayed in the media. And to calculate the needs, we can actually go to a model, and the model is used in a lot of clinical conditions. It's pretty accurate, very accurate, I think. And in the model, you need to know the proportion of sweat fluid losses that is replaced. So, for example, if I sweat like 2 liters, how many of those 2 liters will I replace? Is that 50% or is it 90%? If I don't replace a lot, then I don't need any additional sodium. or the sodium losses are really, really small. If I replace 90%, well, then it becomes a slightly different story. So only in situations where you drink almost as much as you lose, this is where sodium may become important. But the advice very often is to drink quite a lot less, or like say you're sweating 2 liters per hour. There's no way that you could drink 2 liters per hour or 1.8 liters per hour. So you would always be somewhere in this category where it's really not that important. So we came up with this sort of scheme, and whether you need sodium depends on a number of factors. The first factor is the exercise long enough? If it's shorter than 4 hours, you don't need it, is essentially the conclusion. If it's more than 4 hours, then it depends. It depends on how much you sweat. If you sweat a lot, then maybe counterintuitive, but if you sweat a lot, you don't need to worry. If you sweat relatively little, well, relatively little, still less than 1.8 liters per hour, then it depends on how much of that fluid you're actually replacing. If you're replacing less than 70%, don't worry. But if you're drinking loads, and so a high percentage of this 1.8 or 1.5 liters per hour, then you may then have to look at your sweat sodium. If you sweat more than your salty sweater and you sweat more than 1 gram per liter, yes, this is where you need to replace some, not all, some of the sodium losses. But if your sweat sodium is less than 1 gram per liter, you don't need to worry. So that's the story on sodium. And now I've got just a couple of slides on the product. This is the reason why in the Neversecond products, we put 200 milligrams of sodium. We could have easily put 500 in there, or 800, or whatever the number would have been, because it's a very cheap ingredient. But we decided 200 milligrams because that's probably, it gives some sodium. Sodium is beneficial in that it makes you a little bit thirstier, and therefore you probably drink more, and that helps with hydration. But you don't need the sodium in most situations, to replace the losses. I also want to point out that the system of products has, each product has 30 grams of carbohydrates or multiples thereof. So this is the C90. You can also see that back here in the units. This would be 3 units, and 1 C30 would be 1 unit. All of the products have multiple transportable carbohydrates, and that also helps with hydration. So if you compare a normal carbohydrate, or one, say, glucose, and you compare it with multiple transportable carbohydrates, glucose and fructose, then you get more water absorption with the 2 types of carbohydrate. So that's summarized here. Multiple transportable carbohydrates result in improved carbohydrate delivery. It helps with gastric emptying. It helps with fluid delivery. And of course, if you absorb more carbohydrate and more fluid, it also means fewer GI problems, and ultimately delayed onset of fatigue and improved performance. So those are the reasons to have multiple transportable carbohydrates. But I should also point out that that only works at higher intakes of the carbohydrate. So if you're just doing an hour of exercise, well, there's no need for the higher intakes. And a lot of these things are also not necessary and don't really work. But anything over 2.5 hours, that's where this becomes really important. So I've talked more than enough. So I'm gonna stop sharing the screen, and I'm gonna talk to Will about sort of maybe first touch on the topic of hydration, Will, and
Sure.
so how important is that now at the Vuelta, and how do you approach it with the riders?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've shown through your slides and how important, or how much of an effect it can actually make on performance, and that 2% being the general kind of guideline, but varying a lot for different riders. And I think, you know, the way that we've approached this this year, this is like the second year of the kind of nutrition program that we're going through, that we've started to do a lot of fluid loss testing and sodium loss testing for the riders across the team. And, as you've shown there, even within our team, I've got guys that I tested just before the tour that range between 1.2 liters an hour in 35 degrees heat and 50% humidity, up to 2.1 liters an hour. And there's already a huge spectrum there. And then going further with the sodium loss rate as well, looking at how much they lose. And we've got on record data on guys from 180 milligrams a liter loss of sodium up to 1400. So there is a huge spectrum, and we gather that information, do that testing with the guys, and then give them recommendations based upon the kind of environments that they're going to be, because that loss rate will also be affected by that environment, how hot it is, how humid it is, and the day ahead, especially if they're going to be in the break as well. So for a lot of the guys, they kind of fit into that bracket where you don't need to drink or worry about it too much from a sodium perspective, and that most guys, especially at the Vuelta, when it gets to 40 degrees, will drink around 2 bottles an hour anyway. I think the lowest we'll see probably be 1.5 bottles an hour, and the bottles that we're using currently are 600 mils. So they're going anywhere between 1 liter to kind of 1200 milliliters, possibly a bit more for depending on the stage.
And how individual is the advice that you give them? And
yeah, so the guys that we've found that have a higher fluid loss or a higher sodium loss rate, we then give them a recommendation if it's a very particularly hot day on what to do, and we leave them to manage that themselves, which kind of comes into, I think, something we're going to talk a bit more as we go through this talk. But it's kind of giving them that advice, letting them know there's maybe an extra consideration for a particular day if it is going to be 40+ degrees, or if they are going to go in the break. And that could be a case of just having, an extra bid on with an electrolyte before, or some sodium in it before, or extra sodium with their breakfast in the morning, just to ensure they're in a euhydrated state and that they have sufficient sodium that's not, been a problem, or not so much of a problem, but been depleted from the day before if they haven't rehydrated properly.
And so what do you give them in terms of, because they, like, so a lot of the times they will probably be asking for water, sometimes sports drinks. What is sort of the plan there, and what do you, like, how does it work in a stage, also with feed zones and everything? How do you divide it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have a chart for the soigneurs and in the bus that dictates, essentially based upon temperature and humidity of the day, the feeds in the musette bags are then prescribed differently based upon that. And every time they go to a feed, the rider then knows what's going to be at that feed and what's going to be in that musette bag. So it could be a case that on a particularly hot stage, if there's 2 people at a feed or an extra feed, the first bottle will be a C30, the second bottle will be a water, and that allows them to know, okay, they can pick and choose what they want if they have the opportunity to, and it's not going too fast. And then they can, even grab both, use the C30 to help them with their total carbohydrate amount per hour, and then use the water to either do some surface cooling, rinse their mouth, anything like this.
And then maybe tell us a little bit about how you work together with Owen. How does that work? Because obviously you've got an idea in your head how you want to do this, and then Owen is executing a lot of it there. And then besides Owen, there's probably other people involved in delivering sort of some of the strategy as well. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So me and Owen chat before all the grand tours, and then he creates like a menu that we then talk over, and then I give him any considerations and things in specific that we might be looking at, which could be low fiber for specific stages with specific riders, and create more guidelines for Owen, so then he can work within those guidelines and still have his opportunity to create recipes and use, as he mentioned, the kind of ingredients that we get as we go along, because there's going to be some change within that, I think.
Do you have a sales pitch when you like Owens, when you give those gels to the riders? Is your sales pitch just as good as Owens?
I don't think so. Owen's a particularly good salesman.
That's brilliant. I don't know if I've forgotten anything to ask, but I think we probably have a few questions already. And I don't want to. This is partly the whole idea of the session is that we open this up so that people can ask the questions that they have, and then we'll see whether Will or Owen can answer these questions, and if they're questions that I can help with, and I will jump in. But
sure.
There are a lot of questions, so yeah, and they keep building, which is great. So yeah, let's dive in. Let's see here. Let's go back to the beginning. Quite a lot of questions. A question comes in from Irina. She asks, why is there such a great variability in sweat loss and sodium loss?
Yeah, so I take that one. Will?
Yeah.
It's a really difficult question, and I'm not sure I can actually answer it and answer it very well. The theories that have been investigated is like there was a long time there was this idea like, well, it's probably a reflection of your diet. So if you eat very so salty, then your sweat will be very salty, and to some degree that's true, but it only explains a small percentage of it. So it's not just diet. Personally, I think that a lot of it is genetic. Especially when it comes to sweat rate, but also not everyone agrees with that. There are scientists that have other opinions and don't think that there is a large genetic component. But I do believe that there is, because simply some situations are difficult to explain or impossible for me to explain without there being this genetic difference. So yeah, I think it may be related to sweat glands and how they operate. What we do know is that you can condition it very well, and the reabsorption of electrolytes like increases a lot with training, and that is part of sort of heat acclimation as well. So that is a factor that definitely has a very large effect. But even like in what Will is describing, the differences between those riders, well, there's very little difference in heat acclimation between those guys, but you still see these huge differences in sweat rate and sodium losses.
Completely. And purely anecdotally, really, this isn't research based, but definitely see between the kind of regions that riders or athletes come from that I've tested, more Northern European people do tend to have slightly higher sodium loss rate, and people coming from warmer climates tend to have a slightly lower. But that's purely anecdotal from what I've seen and the testing I've done.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot, Will and Oscar. The next question we have is very specifically for Oscar. Kazra asks, curious about highest sweat rate among American football players. Is that due to the size of those guys versus the actual demands of the sport?
Yeah, it's definitely to do with muscle mass. So the muscle is what generates the heat. And even though what they do doesn't take very long, they produce an enormous amount of power and therefore enormous amount of heat. So yeah, it's just a function of muscle mass, more than just a function of body weight. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Oscar. And this is, I guess, a bit more of a challenging question. It's a bit of a challenge here. Question comes in from Yua Schroeder, who asks, Why has the EFSA set the sodium levels for the health claim for sports drinks at over 450 milligrams per liter when it's not necessary?
Yeah, it's because those claims are around absorption and retention of fluid, and that's what. So it basically looks at one single aspect. It is not for a performance claim. So it's not, you cannot claim that if you have that amount of sodium, then performance is improved, because that evidence isn't there. But if you do studies in isolation where you look at just absorption of water, then you can find some of these effects. Personally, I think they are very artificial studies, because you are just looking at absorption in a section of the intestine. You almost in those studies bypass the gut very often, the stomach very often. So it's mostly based on so-called triple lumen studies, where they infuse fluid into the stomach, and then they have a sort of test segment in the intestine, and over usually 30 centimeters, and over the 30 centimeters they measure how much fluid is absorbed. It's quite artificial, and I'm not sure you can really extrapolate it, especially to situations that Will is dealing with, where the riders take water, and then they take a sports drink, and then they take a gel, and then they take a bar, and they mix everything in the stomach. And especially when solid food is consumed, I think all of these claims go out of the window. So
Thanks a lot, Oscar. Next question comes in. The question I think is probably best posed to Will. It says, did the riders take any additional supplements such as zinc, magnesium, iron, so forth?
Yeah, they do. The extra supplements that they take are based upon some of the quarterly bloods that they'll get done, or bloods that we recommend based upon those UCI quarterlies, whether that's vitamin D, based upon their vitamin D levels, or zinc's used typically if they are traveling on a long flight, like a zinc lozenge, just to help with protection against airborne bacteria and viruses. But they are supplemented, and it is normally guided by us based upon blood values and specifics that we know. Test, don't guess, really.
Thanks, Will. This question, let me see if I can even word it correctly. It's a little challenging for me. It says, there are correlation between serum levels in the blood as seen on a chem panel with the amount of sodium in sweat.
Sorry, say that again.
Is there a correlation to serum levels of sodium as seen on a chem panel with the amount of sodium in sweat?
There will be a correlation between those two, yeah.
I was going to say, I think what we may want to do is take that one offline, and what we can do afterwards, we can address it through email or through our Instagram account.
Yeah, that's fine. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see here. Next question. This comes from Arna. Blumenfeld gained weight during his Olympic race. A high dilution volume for lactate equals the increase in pH is lower. Would you relate to this idea despite the fact that your economy of movement is lower?
I can't see any benefit of gaining weight. So to me, that would always be just a matter of having drank too much. There's no benefit that I can think of other than you're just carrying extra water around on the course. It's,
Okay, thank you, Oscar.
Plus, I think I haven't talked about this at all. I've just talked about solid fluid, but what is really important, of course, is where this fluid goes and what compartment it is in. And we have different compartments in the body, and sometimes you want it intramuscular, sometimes you want to have it intracellular. intercellular or extracellular, but very often when athletes drink larger volumes, it's just sitting in the stomach. That's definitely not where you want it. It really needs to be emptied from the stomach and absorbed for it to be effective, of course.
Okay. Next question. This is one that we've talked about a few times. For regular people, this comes in from Christian. Is there a way that you all can recommend that as to help athletes familiarize themselves with their individual sweat rates? What would be a method that they could, for instance, do at home?
I think it's probably doing the same thing that Will does with his with his riders. It's not super complicated. So the piece of equipment you need is a scale, maybe 2 scales.
Okay.
So definitely you need to measure your body weight before and after training. That's the essence of the measurement. And of course you want to do that without clothes, ideally, because a lot of sweat stays behind in clothes. So if you do it without clothes, then and then actually towel dry yourself, that's going to give you the most accurate measurement. Now, if you drank or ate anything, then of course you need to correct for that. So that's where you need a second scale. So if you have a bottle, for example, put the bottles on the scale before and after as well, and then that will give you the amount that you have consumed. You need to correct for that when you look at weight loss. If you need to go to the toilet during that training or race, usually training, I guess, if you go to the toilet, then that's another thing that you need to correct for. And in studies in a laboratory, we, of course, collect all the urine, we measure it very accurately. That's all like a little bit more tricky in a real life situation. So then we estimate it. Estimate, and usually the number I use is 300 mils for urine production. And that's a rough figure. But if you have that will give you a pretty good idea of your total weight loss. You can calculate that then per hour, and that will give you your sweat loss per hour or your sweat rate per hour. So all of these things, pretty easy to do. And if you do them regularly and you do them in different conditions, hot conditions, cooler conditions, hard training, maybe moderate training, then after a while, you get a really good idea of how much you're going to sweat, and you start to be able to predict, okay, today is this temperature, I'm going to do like hard training, so I expect this to be my sweat loss. And then when you measure it, it's actually going to be fairly accurate. So you become better and better at it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Oscar. Next question comes in relating to advice relating, comparing between cyclists and runners. Lori asks, are your sodium recommendations specific to cycling, or are they good for all endurance sports, such as running, in terms of loss and replenishment?
Yeah, they're no different for whatever sport you do. It's just it's just a matter of fluid loss and sodium loss, and yeah.
Let's see, I think here's a really good question. I think that comes up very frequently from a lot of athletes. So Christian says, I ran into cramps at the end of an event yesterday and thought he drank enough. What is the root cause of a lot of cramps that athletes suffer from? And are there any recommendations that we can give athletes who suffer from cramps?
Yeah, good question. Very difficult one to answer because it's very difficult to study, right? It's really difficult to go into the lab and say, oh, we're going to do like a cramping study today, and we have 10 guys and we're going to induce cramping, because yeah, very difficult. It may not happen. So what people do in laboratory situations is you can actually do those studies with very small muscle groups, and it's usually they use a finger and they electrically stimulate the finger till it cramps. Now, I'm not sure how useful that is for, like, in the translation to sort of whole body and the cramping that we're talking about here. So in the literature, we have very little, but there's also very little evidence that it's related to electrolyte losses, which is sometimes given as an explanation. There is evidence that it is worse when you're dehydration. That evidence is fairly good, but I don't think that dehydration per se is the cause. There's also evidence that it happens more in hot conditions, which probably most people on the call can probably know that from sort of personal experience. But what actually causes it is largely unknown, and the most common explanation is that it is just basically a muscle that is unconditioned to what you're asking it to do. This is why it always happens in races, or it always happens in really hard training, or at least more often it happens in those like more extreme situations that you haven't practiced before. Or if it happens in training, maybe you're just like a little bit more fatigued from the day before, and that's why you get the cramp. So conditioning of the muscle is a really important factor, I think. So what do? Well, you just train and hopefully it doesn't happen. You can always try, because I think there is a little bit of evidence that some cramps are linked to magnesium deficiencies. I would say it's like 0.001% of all cramps, but maybe if you're that 0.001%, it may be useful. But I think in most cases, it's just training, conditioning of the muscle.
Thanks, Oscar. Next question, just a little moving away from sweat and sodium for a minute. A question comes in from Felipe, who asks, are there any vegetarians on the team? And how does the team cook or prepare foods for vegetarians?
Yeah, there are some. We have 3 vegetarians on the team, and there's been like a big education point from myself working with those guys about how they can manage their intakes and what they need to do for the extra considerations that come with being a vegetarian, and the difficulties that might come with achieving certain things, whether that's protein intake, especially at races and events. And then obviously Owen, who can answer as well, can talk about the kind of meals and food that is provided at the race for those guys. There's one currently at the Vuelta who's vegetarian, and Owen cooks a separate protein source for him each day.
Wow.
I wonder if he can join in and say a little bit about it, or if he's seems busy.
Owen is hiding, doesn't want to answer this one.
We can come back to that. That's fine. We'll probably have time for maybe 3 more questions. And then anything that we are unable to answer on the webinar, we'll address offline with any of the questions that we received. You can also reach out to us at hello@never2.com with any questions that you have at any point, and we'll be happy to answer that. Again, the email address to send questions to is hello@never2.com. 3 more questions. Let's see here. Let's see. Oh, this is a good question. It relates to sodium tablets. It always comes up with athletes. We have, Oscar, you've talked and earlier in the webinar about how we've created the Neversecond products around 200 milligrams of sodium per serving. A lot of athletes ask us if they need to add additional sodium tabs. What is your answer to a question like that? In this case, Ria is doing long course marathon and is asking if she needs sodium tablets or not.
Yeah, so I would use the sort of the table or the flow diagram that I showed and just go through it, starting with the question: is it more than 4 hours? If the answer is yes, continue, and then just work your way down, and that at the end that will actually tell you whether you need it in the first place, and if so, how much. So yeah, I think if you follow that, you should be able to get the answer. We're developing a tool that will actually help you, like an app that's where you just put in or answer some questions, and that will give you the answer to how much you need. But salt tablets is usually, they're very large amounts. And I think one of the things that people don't realize, people know about, drinks need to be hypertonic and isotonic. And then they take a whole bunch of these salt tablets. And of course, what's in your stomach is nowhere near, it's incredibly hypertonic, because sodium has a huge effect on osmolality of your stomach content. And that's something that is usually the same people that say, oh, I need isotonic drinks and I need salt tablets. Well, yeah, but then it's pointless taking isotonic drinks if you think you need that. So.
Second to last question comes in, Oscar, from Simon Barr, who asks, why do the gels contain 200 milligrams of sodium if it doesn't seem to be that necessary?
Yeah, and that's true. It's a small amount, and two reasons, I think, and they both have to do with encouraging consumption, because you're not going to solve like any hydration issue if you don't drink it. So you need to drink it, and in order to drink it, and studies also show this, if it tastes better, you'll drink more. If it's a little bit saltier, then you'll also drink more. So from that aspect is we just added a small amount, and it helps the taste profile a little bit, and it keeps you drinking essentially. So
okay,
yeah.
Thank you very much. Last question. Let's see here. Okay, let's try this one. Caroline Kavanaugh asks, do you use a top end percentage of sweat loss to determine fluid intake to guide athletes? As an example, 50% of sweat loss.
No, is the short answer. The longer answer is I start with the end point. So it's you start with, what do I want them to lose at the end of the event? And that's usually somewhere between 2 and 3%. So 3% if it's cold, 2% if it's really hot, essentially. So then you calculate it basically. So it's like what is 3% of their body weight, and then that over the duration of 3 or 4 hours or whatever the duration is. How much do they have to drink? And of course, the longer the exercise, the more, like, the larger the percentages they have to drink. And the shorter it is, like the more that you will be in the region of 50% or even less. That's how I would calculate it. So it's the percentage of sweat loss that needs to be replaced is a resultant of the actual, like, total calculation.
Oh, thanks a lot, Oscar. That really clarifies. Appreciate that. We have one more question from Sheila, who asks, where can I buy Neversecond products? But it looks like, Sheila, you found it. The answer is never2.com. Have a visit. I also welcome and wanted to bring to your attention that we have a Discover Science section on our website, which I think is a great blog section that talks about a lot of the different subjects pertaining to performance nutrition, that with an unbiased view that I think is definitely worth taking a look at as well. We wanted to thank Oscar and Will and Owen for being here today. It's been super informative, especially considering how busy you guys are. And we wish you and the team the best of the luck at during the rest of the Vuelta. And again, thank you again for your time.
Thanks
Very great.
much.
Thanks very much, Owen and Will.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day.
Have a good day, guys.
You too.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.